my goodness.
You can tell it tomorrow at Rotary.
I think I told her to Rotary last week.
Okay,
Please start.
let's get this back on track. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of Troy City Council. It is Monday, October 19th at 7 p.m. We welcome everybody. Tonight we will begin with an invocation and a pledge of allegiance from Council Member Bobby Phillips. Please rise.
Thank you. Let's all bow our heads. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Please wrap your arms around our world and give aid and comfort where it is needed. There are many people that we know personally that are affected by many challenges in our world today. Have the COVID on their mind, the elections on their mind, and other things. But let's move forward for our community, make good choices, and do good business. So words, we pray, and in your name, amen.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Here.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Here.
Mrs. Snead. Here. Mr. Sievert,
Here.
Mr. Swazer,
Here.
Mr. Rozell,
Here.
Mr. Phillips,
Present.
Mr. Allen,
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Move to excuse Mr. Schilling.
Second.
It's been moved to excuse Mr. Schilling by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Siebert. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead. Yes. Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling is excused.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read a summary of the minutes of the October 5th, 2020 meeting of council?
Minutes of Council, October 5, 2020. The outgoing members of the Mayor's Youth Council were recognized. There was a presentation made to the quarterly recycling winners. A public hearing was held on ordinance number 044, 2020. Committee reports, Community and Economic Development Committee recommended that legislation be prepared regarding the Ferryman Kerber annexation. Streets and Sidewalks Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing an agreement for professional services for the State Route 41 Interconnect project. Resolution number R57, 2020, professional services with EMH&T of Columbus regarding the State Route 41 Interconnect project was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R58, 2020. Statement of municipal services for the Ferryman Kerber annexation was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R59, 2020. Buffering requirements for the same annexation was given first reading and was adopted. Resolution number R60, 2020, consenting to the annexation, first reading and adopted. Ordinance 044, 2020, amending general plan of Troy Christian Schools Performing Arts Center was given public hearing and second reading. Following comments, council adjourned at 7:25 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist to approve the reading. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snead. Yes. Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We'll go on to committee reports. We have a plethora of committee reports this evening. We will begin with the Community and Economic Development Committee with Mrs. Snead.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Community and Economic Development Committee met on October 12th to review the recommendation from the Troy Planning Commission that a major change to the general plan of the Troy Christian Schools Education and Performing Arts Facility Planned Development be approved by council. The change is discussed in the detailed report. No comments regarding the change were received at the October 5th public hearing. This committee supports the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission and the findings of staff and recommends that ordinance number 044, 2020 be approved to provide for the proposed major change to the general plan of the Troy Christian Schools Education and Performing Arts Facility Planned Development. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snead. Do any council members have any comments or questions on the report? Moving on, we will go to the Community Partnerships Committee and Mr. Rozell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Community Partnerships Committee met on October 12th regarding recommending the transfer of the property located at 2290 North Troy City Road, parcel of 1.447 acres that has been declared surplus to the Community Improvement Corporation for the City of Troy, Ohio, CIC, so that the CIC can authorize a licensed realtor to market the property on the city's behalf. The city has not been successful in 2 bids to sell the property. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the transfer of in-lot 10631, a 1.447 acre parcel at 2290 North Troy City Road to the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio, so the CIC can proceed to utilize the services of a licensed realtor to market the property on behalf of the city. This is respectfully submitted by members Zach Allen, John Schweizer, and myself as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rozell. Are there any comments or questions on this report? We will move on to the Finance Committee and Mr. Schweizer.
Yes, we have one report tonight. This committee met on October 12th to consider legislation finding that public safety personnel, as other administrative personnel, are substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 health emergency. This is needed for reporting the allocation of the funds the city has received related to the COVID-19 relief. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared finding that public safety personnel, as well as other administrative personnel, are substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency, so that the resolution is in place prior to the date for the final report allocating the expenditure of Troy's funds. This committee supports emergency legislation, and this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Siebert, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schweizer. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to the Law and Ordinance Committee and Mr. Siebert.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will read my report and then I do have a question of Mr. Kerber, or 2 questions actually. On October 12th, this committee met regarding recommending establishing a nuisance abatement code to provide a mechanism for gaining property maintenance compliance under particular circumstances not addressed by the International Property Maintenance Code. At a minimum, the circumstances addressed will include public nuisances that occur when property taxes have remained unpaid in excess of 1 year from the date of the assessment, or real estate in which 2 or more separate felony violations have occurred within a 12-month period, and when criminal activity occurs on more than 2 separate occasions. And I guess I have 3, actually maybe at least 3 questions. Where we say and when criminal activity, should that be an or? Because that's actually a separate category, right?
Yes, it would be.
Okay. And then the second question I have is in the actual legislation that was provided to us, we have under the penalties section, whoever violates the provision of this code is guilty of a misdemeanor in the 4th degree.
Correct.
However, in our materials, it says that the code will include a penalty provision as a misdemeanor of the 2nd degree. So I didn't know if that was, which one of those was going to be applicable. Are we doing a 2nd degree penalty phase or are we doing a 4th degree?
Well, it's my understanding that the legislation has a 4th degree penalty section.
In our materials under the detailed report, it specifically says the code would include penalty provisions as a misdemeanor of the 2nd degree.
What my recollection from the committee meeting was that we discussed the 4th degree.
Okay, that's my understanding as well. I just wanted to make sure that the detailed report is corrected for the record. So it's going to be a misdemeanor of the 4th degree, correct?
And that was always my understanding.
That was mine too, which is what prompted me when I saw that today to look at the enforcement. And then I guess that I had a discussion with the safety service director who assured me that he thought this was okay, but I want to confer with you that when we talk about owner, there's lots of relation back to the word person. do you feel that this is sufficient to enforce against, because I know there's language about mortgage holders, lessors, et cetera, against entities that would perhaps, for liability purposes or for whatever reason, structure LLCs or some sort of holding entity where we reference person? Do you think that we can revert back to, do you think we have enough teeth in here to go against any sort of entity that would hold?
I believe so, Mr. C, because within other portions of the revised code, they define person as including any other sort of corporate structure or LLC or something of that nature.
Okay, that's what my recollection, that's what Patrick and I were talking about. So that's, I just wanted to clarify that.
Right.
So, thank you for your time and thank you for your work on this.
Oh, no problem.
It's good. I don't have anything further.
Mr. Seer, can I kindly ask you to read the recommendation?
It is recommended the legislation be prepared to establish a nuisance abatement code, which has been discussed.
And that has been respectfully submitted by Mr. Schweizer, Mr. Steve, Mrs. Steve.
Me and myself.
Do any council members have any additional comments or questions on this? Mr. Phillips, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is directed at Mr. Kerber also, I would assume. Is this necessarily, we may not be needing to go after the property owner or a rentor or a leaseor? Is there some avenue to, if somebody has a long-term lease on a property that they're supposed to maintain, I'm wondering about the ownership having to bear that responsibility when it may not be their issue.
Well, this was designed, and actually there was a lot of consultation with other cities' codes as well. It's to give flexibility if there is a situation where somebody might be either, I don't want to use, is sort of using the protections of an LLC or some sort of corporation or a tendency to avoid the responsibility. Ultimately, you want to have enough flexibility to get to the root of the problem. And that's why there's a lot of different references to who could be held accountable for that. But obviously the enforcement mechanism, you want to go after who can just correct the problem.
And is the fourth degree going to be strong enough? Or is there an escalation?
Well, it does provide for civil penalties as well as, and under these types of codes, every separate day is a separate offense. So normally, those provisions provide enough remedies in the normal situation to get things done. Now, I think there's an important component to take a look at, that this is a menu of options that one doesn't take precedent over the other. So if we get into a really sticky situation, we could always apply to the common police court for injunctive relief that could be a little bit more, it could catch the person's attention a little better.
All right, thank you.
Any other comments or questions from council members on this item? We move on to reports from the Parks and Recreation Committee, and standing in for Mr. Schilling tonight is Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. President. On October 12th, this committee met regarding the recommendation of the Board of Park Commissioners that 3 parcels be declared as surplus. This is based on encroachments onto park land, with the recommended remedy being to declare the area of encroachment as surplus. The recommendation of the board covers 2 parcels in the Edgewater Park and 1 parcel at Haywood Park that are further discussed in the detailed report. The recommendation, it is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared declaring as surplus the 3 parcels, and that the land then be offered for sale that are indicated in the detailed report. We note that legislation will not be submitted until staff has been able to complete surveys and have actual plat maps prepared and approved. And this is respectfully submitted by myself, Mr. Terwilliger, and Mr. Schilling as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Any comments or questions on this item? Mr. Phillips, go ahead to the second report.
Continuing on October 12th, this committee met regarding the recommendation of the Board of Park Commissioners that smoking be banned at public parks. We are asking that information be provided to the board as the committee has requested additional clarification and guidance of the board, such as items discussed in the detailed information. In the interim, we are not making a recommendation on this item, and this again is respectfully submitted by Mr. Terwilliger, myself, and Mr. Schilling as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Any comments or questions on that item? Seeing none, we will go to the Safety and Health Committee and Mr. Terwilliger.
On October 12th, this committee met regarding bidding self-contained breathing apparatus equipment for fire department in the amount of $273,000. The fire department has received a FEMA grant for the equipment to the amount of $231,366. City is required to bid the equipment and fund the difference. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for self-contained breathing apparatus for the fire department at a cost not to exceed $273,000. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Schilling, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Terwilliger. Do any council members have any comments? To wrap up our reports tonight, we have an oral report from the Personnel Committee and Mr. Twist.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. The mayor's requested council to approve reappointments to the Enterprise Zone Tax Incentive Review Council. So I would like to move that council approve the reappointments of Matthew Post and Jordan Romberger to the Enterprise Zone Tax Incentive Review Council for new terms commencing immediately and continuing through October 19th, 2023.
Thank you, Mr. Twist. Is there a second on the motion?
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Schweizer. Any final comments or questions on the motion? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneak.
Yes.
Motion is approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We move into resolutions for the evening. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R61, 2020?
Resolution number R61, 2020, a resolution finding that public safety personnel of the city of Troy are substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. House Councilor Schweizer.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schweizer, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneak,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mrs. Snee and seconded by Mr. Twist. Any further comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneak,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R62, 2020?
Resolution number R62, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for self-contained breathing apparatus equipment for the fire department of the City of Troy, Ohio. Cost not to exceed $273,000. This cost is offset by a grant in the amount of $231,366. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. House Councilor Schoen.
Move to suspend. Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Terwilliger, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Tonight we have a resolution in memoriam for Mr. Alan Anderson, who formerly served on council. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the resolution?
Resolution in memoriam, Alan Anderson, 1943 to 2020. Whereas the members of council for the city of Troy recognize on behalf of all Troy citizens the service to our city by the late Alan Anderson. And whereas Alan Anderson was a longtime resident of the city of Troy, Ohio, who loved history and shared his love and enthusiasm for history with his students over his years as an educator with the Troy City Schools. And whereas Alan Anderson particularly served the city of Troy, Ohio as a Troy City Council member from January 1, 1974 through December 31, 1975. And whereas Alan Anderson was removed from our midst by death on October 11, 2020. Now therefore be it resolved by the Council of the City of Troy, Ohio, that this expression of appreciation for the dedicated service of Alan Anderson to this city and the citizens of this community be extended with sincere sympathy to Mrs. Nancy Anderson and members of the family of Alan Anderson. Be it further resolved that a notation of this resolution be placed in the official records of the City of Troy, Ohio, and that the clerk of council is hereby directed and instructed to forward a duly attested and signed copy of the resolution to the family of Alan Anderson.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We have a motion to approve the
So
resolution.
moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Rozell to approve the resolution in memoriam. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Is approved.
Thank you, members. Mrs. Knight will make sure that the resolution is passed to everybody
Yes.
so that you can please sign it before you leave this evening. And we move on to ordinances. First ordinance is ordinance 044-2020. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 044-2020. Ordinance amending the general plan of the Troy Christian Schools Education and Performing Arts Facility Plan Development, PDR, in the city of Troy, Ohio, and rezoning a 0.178 acre parcel added to this plan development as a part of the amended general plan from R5 Single Family Residential Zoning District to a Residential Plan Development, PDR. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. This is the third reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. House counsel, please move.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mrs. Snead. Any further comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 045-2020?
Ordinance number 045-2020, an ordinance establishing chapter 523 nuisance abatement code of the codified ordinances of the city of Troy, Ohio. First reading.
How does the council wish to act on the item?
Move for suspension.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Terwilliger. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. The ordinance has been moved for adoption by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Rozell. Any further comments or questions?
Mr. President,
Mr.
just
Seaver.
real quick, because I do think it's important for people to understand this, because there was some confusion. This is a nuisance abatement. It's not going to be sort of a property maintenance issue. So I think that for people who did not watch or attend the committee, I do think that it's important that we let people understand what the purpose of this is that's going on.
Excellent.
I
Thank
don't
you,
have
Mr. Seaver. Any other comments or questions before we vote? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll for the vote of the ordinance.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last ordinance of the evening, 046-2020?
Ordinance number 046, 2020. Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio to enter into an agreement with the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio regarding the sale of in-lot 10631 on behalf of the city. This was reported on this evening, first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to act?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule. Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert.
Yes.
Three reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
It has been moved to adopt by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. I believe. Any further comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. That concludes our ordinances for the evening. We move on to communications and announcements. Mayor Robin Oda.
I would just encourage everybody to take advantage of their right to vote and make sure you vote sometime over the next 2 weeks.
Thank you, Mayor. Moving on to Director of Public Service Safety, Mr. Titterington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of brief reminders. Halloween in Troy will be on October 29th. That's a Thursday, from 6 to 8 p.m. Today we started, I guess we started leaf collection. Weather didn't really cooperate too much, but piles are starting to accumulate. Just a reminder that is leaves only. Please do not mix brush with your leaves. Separate the brush, either put them in the yard bags, which you can buy anywhere, or bundle sticks and put them separate from the leaf piles. And also, if you want, dye mill facility is open most days during the week still and on the weekend, except for Sunday. And that will remain open until the Saturday after Thanksgiving or November 28th. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I do believe the mayor has another comment, so we'll go back to the mayor.
Sue just reminded me that we have extended the state of emergency, which is not really what I want to do, but given the governor's orders, it is how we are able to meet here in this room versus council chambers. And so when we have public hearings and we have to put notices in the newspaper 30 days ahead, we had to go ahead and do that because things had already been announced. So we are extending the state of emergency for the time being.
Thank you, ma'am. Moving on, Director of Law, Mr. Kerber.
I have nothing this evening, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kerber. City Auditor, Mr. Friggy.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing at this time.
Thank you, sir. I would just add, due to the extension of the state of emergency, council will continue to meet in this room either until the emergency is over or until the room limits allow us to meet back in council chambers. Moving on to council, do any council members have any comments or questions they wish to make this evening?
I have two.
Mr. Siebert, please go ahead.
Thank you. First, I've had the honor and privilege to serve as the liaison, I guess, to a member of the Human Relations Committee. As I commented when I walked in almost belatedly to the meeting today, we did have a meeting today just to apprise council It's going very well. We've had the opportunity to hear from a number of community leaders and people who are involved in the community. Sean McKinney and I think Patrick gave last Thursday. Mr. Funderburg's addressed the group. There's been a group of the Board of Elections addressed the group. Member from there, a couple of nonprofits have addressed the group. We're still looking at some corporate people who are going to come and address. But I can tell you, Madam Mayor and Council, it is the plan of the HRC to pare down their recommendations, and we did a good job of that today, and present by the end of the year a list of recommendations for consideration by this body. So I wanted to just surprise council as to what is going on with that committee. It's been a while since there's been any discussion on the council level with that, so I wanted to let them know. Second, Mr. President, on November the 7th, the at-large committee members, Ms. Snee, Mr. Rozelle, and myself will be meeting at the Bravo Room, so right here at 9 o'clock in the morning with some donuts and orange juice for just sort of an informal discussion. If you have any questions about the city government, or things that you want to bring to the city's attention and you find it difficult to come to the evening meetings, these are just sort of informal. There'll be no legislation discussed, talked about. It's just sort of a reach out program to expand so that people can feel that they can become involved. So I would encourage anybody, if you just want to come and have a donut, or if you have some issues that you wish to bring before the body, to please join us on November 7th at 9 o'clock.
Thank you, Mr.
That will
Seaton.
be it.
Thank you, Mr. Seaton. Any further comments or questions from council members? Any comments from staff members this evening? Any comments from the general public? You're more than welcome to come forward. Please give your name and address and take as much time as you wish to consume. Seeing none, this meeting stands adjourned. Thank you for being here this evening.